Following program is closed captioned for the thinking impaired.
Welcome to the Lederman Studio Radio Show, presenting our world with the stories that everyone wanted, but didn't realize until they were told. Let's get started. Here's your host, Jeremie Lederman.
When Captain America throws his mighty shield, all those who chose to oppose his shield must yield. If he's led to a fight and a duel is due, then the red and the white and the blue will come through when Captain America throws his mighty shield.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to the podcast once again. I am your host, Jeremie Lederman from Lederman Studio. Welcome to part 2 of a 2-part podcast. This was a little special project I put together because the content was just so extensive. I did not want to break my sort of unspoken rule of going over 25 minutes. In part 1, I went through a little bit of history on the creators, Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, a little bit of history on where comic books come from, and then a little bit of context of what set up the environment that brought us Captain America in the first place. So in this episode, we will cover through the character Captain America, a little bit about his history, and tell you some really cool little factoids that I think you're going to enjoy.
Part 1. Let's all wear our underwear on the outside.
Okay, so in part 1, I shared a timeline for when superheroes began to emerge in the comic book format. Most people are not aware of how old these characters really are. To start with, let me answer that little question everybody has. Why are all the superheroes wearing colorful underwear on the outside of their pants? I'm sure you've wondered why are they doing this? Well, this is a real direct reflection of just how old the superhero genre really is. Now, back in the old days, when men that used to box had big fluffy mustaches, and they positioned themselves in a weird stance and had their arms and had that neat little pugilist look to them, well, they wore those really bright, colorful shorts when they were inside the ring. This was the primary reason why superheroes have it too. They were modeled after these old prize fighters. Now, while there's no doubt that Superman, Batman, all the other mans, all the other womans, all the other supers, they're a fixture in American culture, but the one that I think really does stand out is Captain America. He has a very unique blend and all sorts of roots that go in so many directions that I think it's really worth telling this story. Now, while many people do suspect he probably began in the 60s, his first appearance was actually in May of 1941. Now, let me begin by giving you a quick synopsis of what that first issue of Captain America looked like. It's a comic book about a man named Steve Rogers, a scrawny, weak, unhealthy person. He grew up as a poor kid from the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and he had a drunken father and a weak mother, and by the time he's 14 years old, they have both died off, leaving him an orphan. But he took up cartooning, and he was a fine artist, and he was never too afraid to fight off a bully despite his physical weakness. After many unsuccessful attempts to join the army, he's given a chance to fight if he will submit to a secret experiment. Now, does this sound a lot like the movie you saw? It's amazing because the movie modeled everything off of this comic book that preceded it by nearly 70 years. So then the German professor, Dr. Erskine, he's the one that selected Steve Rogers for this experiment. He injects him with the super soldier serum, and then he gets blasted by Vita rays. Steve Rogers is then transformed into what is known as a perfect human specimen. He has enormous strength, he's got great agility, endurance, tactical skills, and becomes a strategist and a soldier of the highest caliber. Captain America is now also dangerously accurate with this indestructible shield. He uses it for offense and defense, and of course the rest is history. And if you've seen the movie, then you realize that right after his transformation, suddenly a Nazi spy shoots the doctor that just created the serum. Bristling with his new powers, Captain America leaps forth and kills this spy, but is unable to save the doctor. The army had hoped to create an army of super soldiers, but now all they have is Steve Rogers, soon to become Captain America. Now, when Joe Simon, when he first imagined this hero, he was simply trying to find another idea to sell comics through. This was their job. They were trying to sell comics. And if you listen to the other podcast, you remember, millions and millions of copies of comics were being sold. This wasn't just a little niche. This was a phenomenon. So when he and Kirby began to bring Captain America to life, they had no idea how successful and iconic things would become.
I was 24 when we first created Captain America. Jack Kirby was 22. At the beginning there, Batman was doing very well, basically on the use of his villains. So I said, maybe that's the answer, you know, get yourself a good villain and then get a foil for the villain instead of the other way around. And so Adolf Hitler was there. So I figured, well, he's a live one on his own brutal way, as we all know. He'll be the villain, and get yourself a patriotic guy to be his foil. So we designed Captain America. Well, it had a different look than the other comic books. Jack Kirby did some really great action figures, and I was a great layout man. And the first issue sold out 97%.
Now, Joe was the main editor at Timely Comics, later to be known as Marvel Comics. He came up with the Captain America idea, created sketches of how the iconic costume and the shield would look, and then Joe said that he used Captain America instead of Super American. He said there were already too many supers already. When he presented the idea to the publisher, he was not only given the go-ahead, but he was told to make it a solo comic and produce it right away.
Well, Captain America came from a discussion between Joe Simon and myself. And we were in a period where we had to get a job. And Joe and I met, and we became partners. We discussed this idea about America. This was at a time when everybody was patriotic. And it was ridiculous not to do Captain America, because there was an idea that would have been bought by everybody. So Joe and I did that. Our job was to sell comic books, and we did.
Originally, this tight deadline was so demanding that Joe offered two other artists the job to try to maximize the time they had, but apparently Jack Kirby freaked out, and he said, look, I'll get this whole thing done myself, and I'll do it in record time. And that's exactly what happened. Joe and Jack would then produce the first 10 issues of Captain America together before they stepped away. Of course, they had to step away to fight the war. They became soldiers during World War II.
Part 2. Let's all punch Hitler in the face.
Now here's where I'm going to share some really amazing little factoids about Captain America. First of all, issue 1 came out in May of 1941. If you know your history, you know we weren't even in the war at that point. Japan attacked us on December 7th of 1941, nearly 9 months after this issue came out. Now on the cover, Captain America is actually seen punching Hitler right in the face. Why was this a big deal? You got to realize all of us living right now, listening to the podcast, we grew up in a world where not only were the Nazis beat, but they became the definition of evil. But we hadn't even been in the war when Captain America #1 came out. It's 9 months before we were attacked at Pearl Harbor, and here's a comic book making a violent political statement. Joe and Jack had said that they knew a gangster and a tyrant when they saw one. They were both young Jewish kids. They were both in their 20s when this thing with Hitler started to happen. They felt like they had a moral responsibility to try to take a stand against Hitler's evil. Now, the first issue, it sold nearly 1 million copies, and it was a hit despite the controversy. However, there was controversy. Now get this. Members of the American Nazi Party, as well as other types of socialists or just people who opposed any kind of message of American exceptionalism, they began to take these threats directly to Simon and Kirby. Now, Jack Kirby was no chump. He may have only been about 5'4" to 5'6", but he was a tough little bastard. So keeping that in mind, when they would make these phone calls, Jack would sometimes get these phone calls from self-proclaimed Nazis.
I had Nazis calling me at the Timely office. I once had 6 Nazis call me up, and they said, well, we're waiting for you downstairs. We're going to beat the daylights out of you, you know, for writing these stories about Hitler. These were New York Nazis, and they had a camp on Long Island. And so I said, hold on, guys, I'll be right down. And, of course, I take the elevator down, and but there was nobody there. I looked in the street, and of course they wouldn't be there, and I didn't feel disappointed, and I felt disappointed. It didn't matter to me one way or the other. You know, if they wanted to fight, well, what the heck? I would do it.
This was real interesting. I found out that crowds were gathering outside the offices of Timely Comics. It became such a problem that the mayor of New York, yes, the mayor of New York, he offered police protection and personally called Joe and Jack to give them his support. Now, like I said, eventually Joe and Jack walked away from the comic by issue 10. They did join the armed services to go fight in World War II, but they also had a lot of disputes with the publisher. They had some pretty good sales, though, and they were both definitely benefiting from this time period.
Part 3. Captain America Goes to War.
Now, despite Joe and Jack leaving the comic book, Captain America went on because it belonged to the company. Now, it doesn't mean that the comic maintained its popularity up until that point. The publishers of the book were always trying to find some way to revive those wartime sales. I'll get to those sales in just a minute. They had Captain America trying to fight the Red Scare. They tried to make little TV shows. They tried to do everything. It was pretty much just a comic that sat in the background because after the war was over, nobody was really paying any attention to it. Now, during the war, Captain America was one of the few comic books that actually got involved in the war. There wasn't Superman comics with him fighting Nazis. Now, for the first time, the comic books were really violent, especially for their era. They had people getting tortured, shot in the face, left for bloody messes. This was all obviously a hit with the soldiers. Now, this is where I'm talking about how life and art are imitating each other. The comic book is about a character who was just an everyman, poor little underdog who got turned into a powerful man who could then fight for what was right. And then he went to go help the soldiers who were overseas basically doing the same. In real life, there was a comic book about this going on that would be printed and sent overseas to the soldiers who were actually fighting the war. There's many stories from soldiers who said that the comic book represented what they were fighting for and how they wished they had a soldier like Captain America over there fighting with them. Now, in the stories, Captain America was a man of integrity, he had a very strict moral code, and he didn't depend on anything else but himself and his own sense of what was right and wrong. He was able to win through his integrity, despite all the bad guys basically cheating and breaking all the rules. Now, after the war ended, there was very little context for these soldiers to keep reading the comic. And like I said, while the comic did stay in print, the audience was pretty much gone by 1945.
Part 4. A Unique Icebreaker.
Now, in 1961, we've jumped up quite a bit from World War II, about 20 years. DC Comics releases the Justice League of America and sort of reignites that whole hero team craze that used to be big in the 40s and the 30s. Marvel Comics responds with the Fantastic Four, and they make history. If you listen to the previous podcast, episode 1, I go into great detail about how this all happened. Now, with an insane amount of creative momentum, in 1961, Marvel begins to create the future of Hollywood, basically setting up a stage for intellectual property to make millionaires everywhere. So between 61 and 64, Marvel introduced the Avengers, the Hulk, the X-Men, Daredevil, Doctor Strange, Thor, Spider-Man. The list goes on. Now, one of their new comics is doing extremely well. It's their own real unique superhero team called the Avengers. So in an act of enduring marketing genius, Marvel Comics brings Captain America back from the dead. Avengers number 4 was printed in March of 1964, and it reintroduces Captain America to the country. And again, this is where the art imitating life, imitating art all happens in a most amazing way. But first, here's the story and the synopsis of how they bring Captain America back. Now, the story added a new twist to the fate of Captain America. When they ended the series in the 50s, they really didn't end it with any kind of a story. It just stopped publishing. So in the embellishment they brought to Captain America in 1964, he basically foils a plot to hit New York with a flying bomb. Now, while he's flying on top of the flying bomb, trying to disable it, it was somewhere over in the North Pole. Unfortunately, his sidekick Bucky dies in the process. He falls off and dies in the ice somewhere, which leaves Captain America alone on top of the bomb, flying over the North Pole, where after he disables it, it basically turns off and then drops out of the sky, where he and this flying bomb drop into the North Pole ice. They sink and they freeze. Now, the serum that gave him his super soldier powers They also help him preserve in suspended animation, sort of hibernate in the ice. 20 years go by. The Submariner discovers that the Eskimos are worshipping some sort of a figure frozen in the ice. This block of ice is then brought to the Avengers. They recognize Captain America, and they wonder, is this the same guy?
Who can he be? He has some sort of costume. Red, white, blue.
Yes. Don't you recognize it? It's the costume of Captain America.
So they thaw him out. Now, within seconds of him waking up, Captain America bursts into a panic and single-handedly hands every one of the Avengers their ass before he finally gains his bearings and goes, whoa.
He's alive. His eyes.
Bucky! Bucky, look out! You can't kill Bucky. I'll smash you all. Stop him. He's gone mad.
Thus answering the question, was he really Captain America? So then the rest of the comic is basically him spending the rest of his life trying to figure out how to grow up and live in the 60s, as well as lead the Avengers and be like the icon of Americana. Now this is the part that's cool. The reaction from the public, the real public, the human beings that were reading the comics, it was astounding. The comic book brought back a hero to the world and created a real twist in art imitating life. In the comic book, they depicted this old war veteran recognizing Captain America and bursting into tears. They'd heard about his death decades ago, and they were overjoyed to learn he was back.
Wait, I know you. Ah, no, it can't be. But it is. I could never forget, Captain.
You're right, officer. I am Captain America.
All of us. We thought you were dead. And just when the world needs you, you return. And... forgive me, Cap. I seem to have something in my eye.
And it was very patriotic. It was very sentimental. If you get a chance to read it, you might even feel a little touched. Now, in real life, old war veterans who were reading the comic book during the war while they were overseas fighting in Europe and France, they're overjoyed to discover that their hero from over 20 years ago was back. And in real life, there were actual soldiers who'd probably not only fought World War II, but maybe were veterans of Korea at this point. They're middle-aged, and all of a sudden they're in tears because the hero that they used to read and get encouragement from when they were fighting in the war, it's now back in a comic book. Now the story grows even more interesting. Fast forward to 2011, and the premiere of that famous movie, Captain America, the First Avenger. It depicts this exact story that Joe and Jack created all the way back in 1941. Now here's a really cool little moment. In the movie, a really amazing crossover of art, reality, and life and all that was an homage they give to the comic book. Now towards the middle of the movie, when they have that real stroke of genius to try to explain how in the world are they going to get away with that just ridiculous costume, they turn him into a showgirl and he's doing the War Bonds musical. They have a little collage where they show his musical career growing off, and then there's this little cut scene where they show a pile of Captain America comic books being sold. This fictional moment in a movie about a fictional hero is using the real cover of the real comic printed during World War II in an era that was being portrayed in a modern fictional movie about World War II made in 2011.
We are deeply indebted to you, Captain America.
Nonsense. You owe me nothing.
Forget it, Cap. Glad I met you, but I've got to be going now.
I hate to see him go.
I highly recommend that if you find this quick synopsis real interesting, check it out. Do some research of your own and you'll find out just how unique this Captain America character is, and why, I don't know, if you look at the movies, everyone seems to have him in a different regard than all of the other superheroes. He symbolizes a lot, and I think if you watch the movies, if you read the comics, or if you just get to know the character and its history, you might pick up on a little bit of that yourself. I really hope you have enjoyed these 2 episodes. If you did, I would love to get your feedback. I would love to know more about what you thought about it, and if there's anything I could do to make it better, just get a contact, subscribe, write, email, whatever you need. Thank you very much, everyone. Please join us again for more stories.
We're still all reminded about who Captain America is and what he is. And he's a symbol. We need a leader like Captain America. We need a hero, and he was that hero. He's an icon.
Return again for more stories from the Lederman Studio Radio Show.